I'd like to introduce Paul Wright as our first speaker, the director of Citrus, and the newly appointed director of Berkeley, whom I've had the pleasure to work with for the last decade.
How do I get my slides up? Do I just click on that? Wow, what a miracle. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank Bob Bergeneau, the previous chancellor, Graham Fleming, the vice-chancellor, and Paul Alivisatos, who's the director of the Lawrence Berkeley Labs, for starting this institute 2 years ago. And it was around Christmas time that they asked me to be the director, having done Citrus for a long time, and having thought about it for a while and checked in with people like David Culler and Carl Blumstein and my students. Everybody thought it was a good idea, and so I went ahead and did it. The logo especially emphasizes that we are extending I4 Energy in a way that we had before, but trying to make a bigger impact to the lab. That orange part of the logo is the lab, and the Campanile. And the reason why I chose the China-India part of the world is because I think that's where some of the issues are in terms of climate and growth. This complicated chart is worth knowing. It's interesting, Terry Searles has just come back from Hawaii and spends a lot of time there. Where's Terry? So he knows this better than most people. There's this Mauna Loa recording station in Hawaii that has been developed by that father and son team, Ralph and Charles Keeling, over the decades. This is experimental data in this box here. And I think most people in this room know that we're on this trajectory of the greenish line here, which is the current trending rise of CO2. So to get that trending rise, that's an actual quadratic experimental extrapolation of the NASA data. And if we carry on at that rate, most people in this room, especially those that are the youngest set that I was just talking to from the California Energy Commission, I mean, in your lifetimes, you're going to experience carbon levels of 700 parts per million, which if you translate that into climate change and all sorts of... I think I'm okay, actually. Yeah, okay. And so our job collectively is to try and bend that curve over. And I think everybody has seen this kind of activity. The snag, of course, is that other countries, especially China and India, now want to have the same standard of living that we're enjoying sitting in this lecture room here with these lights burning down on my skull. And they want to have that standard of living. And unfortunately, that's causing a huge amount of growth of coal and gas-fired power plants, as, again, you all know. So our job, my job, all of our jobs over the next few decades is to try and bend that curve over, knowing that the growth in the world is going to create a bigger economy. So this complicated chart really is the vision of the chancellor and the vice-chancellors and the lab director to try and integrate all of the activities that are going on campus, and not just the technical people that are in this room, predominantly technical people in this room. We want to involve the business school, the law school, and the public policy school in this, where many famous people that you know, like Severin Bornstein, do these fantastic economic analyses of different kinds of new renewables and so forth. And we want to integrate that work even more with the kind of alternative energy and energy efficiency work that's going to be presented today. At the lab and on campus, we also have large programs in carbon sequestration. And I always joke over a beer that since we've already fouled up the environment, sequestration and scrubbing and so forth is even more important. And I'll get to some slides where we know from recent climatic issues, the most recent ones being in Colorado, that energy is really so connected to climate, and the climate is going out of control in pockets, and we need to address that going forward. All of these things play well together, so that's why I've drawn this something like the clothes going around in your washing machine, and everything should integrate together. This is almost impossible to understand on this slide here, but what I did, just doing some homework over the last 2 or 3 months with people like Sean Waihira in the front, who's the Becky analyst, is just try and populate that previous slide with some of our major research organizations on campus and at the lab. And as you'll see from this incredible laundry list of different kind of research projects, in the top left corner, we have a large amount of colleagues that are doing work in both those locations in what you would call law, energy, public policy. The right-hand side top area shows the I4E, CREST, Citrus kind of work and the EETD group that's being done at the lab. And it lists out many of our famous institutes that are doing biofuels and nuclear engineering and so forth. We do have these big projects on carbon sequestration. And then for the adaptation and resilience work, I would say it's probably our College of Natural Resources which focuses the most on the climate issues and the green chemistry and Berkeley Institute for the Environment and so forth. So it's almost like, I almost often say this, that an irony about Berkeley and the Berkeley labs is that we almost have too much work going on. My job is to try and integrate that over the next 5 years, and I'll need everybody's help that's in this room. The problem, as you know better than most, I'm talking to the choir in this slide here. The main problem which we can't seem to solve and nobody wants to really address is not so much happening in the United States, though we haven't set very good examples, as we all know, for reducing our addiction to coal. Just looking at the World Resources Institute at the moment, this is some data from back in July, over 1,200 coal-fired plants are still planned in the world, predominantly in China and India. And again, as you know, to reach the same heating value, coal emits 133% more CO2 than gas. And in the end, even though gas is relatively the cleanest burning fossil fuel, even that does pollute, as you know. And just recently you saw in The Economist and other magazines that China has now surpassed the US in its annual CO2 production. So now what happens, this is just a close-up again of the Keeling data. What worries me personally, since I now am in the lucky spot in my life where I have grandchildren, if I did the calculation for my young grandchild, my grandson who's only 1 year old, if he lives to be 100, then he's going to be looking at carbon levels of 800 parts per million. And the current prediction is that we'll hit that 450 parts per million around 2037, though the IPCC did just kind of slow that down a bit recently. Even that data doesn't prevent this happening. These are just a couple of screenshots of the Superstorm Sandy activity on the coast of New Jersey and then in New York City, where it's always hard to get a cab in New York City, but it was particularly difficult on that day. And after that, sorry, that's kind of a black joke, I shouldn't do that again. It just popped out of my head, sorry. After that, you know, can I say this in public? Our dumb politicians in Washington finally got the fact that we were in trouble after that Superstorm Sandy. And it's like all those things in human life where you need some horrible accidents on the corner of your street before some idiot from the county will put a red light there. You know how that happens? Human beings are not so smart around that. Anyway, going back to my talk, Waxman and Whitehouse, these are two Democrats, and why it's called the bicameral task force is that it means that it's both the Senate and the Congress. So they have actually formed this task force, and the nicest thing that many of you know is around February after the storm, they called Graham's office, and they said, hey, you guys are running this Berkeley Energy and Climate Institute, can you help us out? So a nice guy called Steve Wiseman, who many of you know, who's in the law school, he started doing some work for FERC, the Federal Energy Regulation Committee, and this is too busy to read because it's some of his recommendations to them. But as a result of the storm, and as a result of Waxman and Whitehouse calling us, we started to do some target-specific work for Washington politicians, developing some hopefully big answers to some big questions. So Steve has been working with them and flying to Washington and having many conference calls with them about how they can impose some kind of carbon adder to the environment of generation. And these are just some of the highlights from the report that Steve recently sent to Washington. This work is going to expand, and I do want to embarrass him in public. Danny Cullenward has just joined us with his PhD from Stanford, and he is the Philomathea Becky Fellow in this general kind of area. His background is in law and economics and also in basic energy. and he'll be very much on the ground over the next year or two at Berkeley to participate in this work. So what I really want to do as the director, and I think I have a lot of support for doing this from people like David and Carl and Jim and others, Dick White, who are in the room here, that we wanted to keep doing the technology work that we're going to present to you at the Energy Commission today, but as much as possible, we want to involve the policy colleagues on campus, we want to involve the lab as much as possible, and to begin to build these research projects, as I called them, to do specific actionable items like this work that Steve Wiseman is doing for FERC. This is just one example. I have been allocated a little bit of money to develop some SWAT teams that can do this kind of work, and I'm hoping, like in that big slide that I showed before, that I can expand the kind of work that Steve Wiseman has been doing. As you know better than most people, California is a great place to start this. Thanks to Arthur Rosenfeld and the 1970s push, we have many good developments that are shown in those 3 or 4 bullets at the beginning. Today, we're a state that's a leader in the world around things like the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the slight beginnings of some kind of carbon trading and auction process. So if we can start this in California, it sounds a little noble as I say this, we would be a model for the United States, and then hopefully the United States will begin to develop some kind of clear policy around renewable energy and carbon trading. And then we can begin to address this curve that I showed at the beginning of my talk. And in the end, we'll develop some equitable growth without carbon throughout the world. This is a long bumper sticker for how I've been trying to see Becky. It's my last slide, where we can see from this quick introductory talk that I just gave, we are at risk. The 7 billion people on the planet are at risk. The younger people in this room are even more at risk, but the grandchildren of the older people in this room are also very much at risk. The snag is that everybody outside of the US and Europe, especially China and India, they want the same cup of coffee, the same air conditioning, the same car that you have, the same nice clothes, the same comfortable life, and that's driving growth in ways that's unsustainable if we rely on coal. So everybody in this room, whether they're developing photovoltaics, building sensors for the smart grid or devices, the various projects that you see that are coming up in the afternoon, we all have an important mission to do this, and this is why at this point in my life, having done citrus for 6 years, I took the challenge of taking on this Becky job, and I look forward to all of you helping me, because I certainly can't do this alone. Thank you very much. Thank you.